There is a particular kind of rain that falls on London in April. It is not the dramatic, theatrical rain of summer storms. It is patient rain, relentless rain, the kind that does not announce itself. It simply arrives and stays, soaking into the seams of your coat, finding every place where your hem was not quite long enough and your boots were not quite thick enough, and settling there like a quiet reminder that the city does not care about you at all. Vivian Cross had been walking in it for 40 minutes. She was 27 years old, which in the year of our Lord 1814 was not a scandal but was certainly a conversation. A solicitor's daughter with dark hair and brown eyes and a face that people called handsome, which meant, in the vocabulary of the drawing rooms she had passed through without ever belonging to, that her intelligence showed in her features and made certain men nervous. She was wearing a pelisse the color of forest in winter, good wool, mended twice at the left cuff, resolute at the shoulder. Her boots were not fashionable. They were, however, waterproof, and she had long since learned to value function over impression. She was walking through Mayfair because it was 6:30 in the morning, and 6:30 in the morning was the only hour a woman in her position could move through these streets without a chaperone, without a purpose that required explaining to anyone, without the particular variety of measuring glance that said, "Who are you, what do you want here, and who permitted you?" She catalogued the houses as she walked. It was a habit she had developed during her first season, 7 years ago, when the Cross name still meant something, and she had ridden through these streets in a hired carriage feeling that some version of belonging was possible. She catalogued them now with the eye of a woman who had since learned how the game was played. The Harrington townhouse, 4 floors, recently repointed stonework, 2 footmen in livery visible through the ground floor window. New money performing old confidence. The Belmore residence, 6 floors, curtains still drawn. The knocker wrapped in black cloth from a death in the family 3 weeks past. A house holding its breath. The Forsyth establishment, modest facade. But she knew from a previous employer that the back rooms housed an art collection worth more than the entire street combined. Wealth that had nothing to prove. The coal smoke came first, always. That particular London smell, thick and mineral and permanent, layered over the river damp that rose from the Thames half a mile south. Behind it, the sound of the night soil men finishing their rounds, the creak of their carts, the hooves of the milk-maids' horses arriving from the city's edges with their morning loads. A cat watched her from a doorstep with the particular indifference of a creature that has made its peace with rain. Vivian had been dismissed yesterday. Lady Pemberry's companion. 6 months. It had been, by her standards, a reasonably managed position. Lady Pemberry was demanding and occasionally unkind in the way that bored women with too much house and too little to occupy them tended to be unkind. But the work was predictable, the room was warm, and the pay was reliable. It had lasted until Lord Pemberry returned from his club 2 weeks ago and began finding reasons to be in whatever room Vivian occupied. Vivian had done nothing wrong. She never did anything wrong. The world, however, did not reserve its consequences for the women who did things wrong. It distributed them with complete impartiality to any woman who happened to be standing in the wrong place when a man decided to be inconvenient. Lady Pemberry had dismissed her with a reference letter written in the tone of a woman who blamed Vivian for existing. She had £3.07. Her mother's physician in Bath had sent a bill that required £12 to clear. Her sister Clara had written 3 days ago. The letter was still in Vivian's coat pocket, reread twice, to say that a young man named Hartley had begun calling. Clara was 19 and romantic and did not yet understand that romance, in a family with no money and a disgraced father's name, was not a luxury. It was a trap with a very pretty door. Vivian turned left onto Grosvenor Square and stopped walking. She stood for a moment in the rain and made herself do what she always did when the situation was worst. She counted what she had, not what she had lost. What remained? A good mind, practical boots, a letter of reference, even a poor one, connections, tenuous but real, through her father's old professional network, and the knowledge, earned slowly at significant personal cost, that she understood the social architecture of Regency England the way a military officer understood terrain. Every weakness, every pressure point, every exit. She did not weep. She began to walk again. Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me. It is essential that we get your support through subscriptions, likes, and comments. So if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for us. Smash the like and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now let's get back to the story. The solicitor's name was Mr. Gibbs. He occupied a set of rooms above a stationer's shop on Albemarle Street. Rooms that smelled of old paper and ink and the particular mustiness of a man who spent more time among documents than among people. Vivian had met him once, 3 years ago, when she had come to him with a question about her father's estate. What remained of it, which was very little, arranged in a way that benefited her father's creditors and no one else. She had not expected Lady Hargrove. The woman was perhaps 60, with the upright posture of someone who had never in her life considered slouching, and the eyes of someone who had been reading people for 6 decades and no longer found it particularly challenging. She was dressed in dark gray silk, good quality, no ornamentation, the clothes of a woman who had nothing to prove to fabric. She sat in the better chair, which meant Gibbs was standing, which told Vivian everything about the relative positions of power in this room. "Miss Cross," she said, not as a greeting but as a confirmation of a fact she had already established. "Lady Hargrove," Vivian replied, and sat down without being invited because standing made you a supplicant and she could not afford to be a supplicant this morning. Lady Hargrove's expression shifted by approximately nothing. "I have read your references. I have spoken with Lady Pemberry. I have also spoken with Mrs. Carlyle, with whom you were employed before that, and with the Dowager Countess of Ashby, whose companion you were for 3 months in 1812. I am aware of your father's history. I am aware of your mother's current situation in Bath. I am aware that you have a younger sister whose future is contingent on your income. I tell you this not to cause distress but to establish that we do not need to spend time on background. I know your situation precisely. The question is whether you know mine." Vivian held her gaze. "You have a problem. You believe I can solve it." "My nephew," Lady Hargrove said, "is the Duke of Carverstone. He is 42 years old, a widower, a former cavalry officer who served with distinction at Salamanca, and the owner of 40,000 acres in Wiltshire. He is also, at present, the most socially impenetrable man in England. He has not attended a social function in 6 years. Parliament is pressing him to marry and produce an heir. I have arranged a suitable match, Miss Eleanor Voss, excellent family, considerable intelligence, the right connections. The arrangement is agreed in principle. Miss Voss will not proceed until she has spent time in his company and found him tolerable." She paused. "He is not, at present, tolerable." Vivian absorbed this. "You need someone to soften him. I need someone to teach him to function in polite society without reducing grown men to tears. Last week at Boodle's, he silenced the entire card room with one sentence directed at a baronet. The baronet wept. The Duke did not raise his voice once. Lady Hargrove set a folded document on the desk. The terms: 8 weeks. You will join the household as a companion, attached to the household rather than to a specific family member, to avoid awkwardness. You will coach him privately on social engagement and accompany the household to relevant functions. You will assist in creating successful interactions with Miss Voss. You will sign a document of absolute discretion. You will be paid £200, half on commencement, half on completion. £200. Vivian did not visibly react because she had trained herself not to, but inside she did a rapid calculation. £12 for the physician, 30 for Clara's modest season, a room for her mother through the winter. The rest in savings, the first savings she would have had in 3 years. 3 questions, Vivian said. Ask them. If the match fails despite my best efforts, not through negligence but through genuine incompatibility, do I forfeit the second payment? No. If the Duke proves genuinely uncoachable and I judge it necessary to terminate the arrangement, what are the terms? You retain what you have been paid. You sign an additional discretion clause. And if, despite every effort on both sides, Miss Voss simply decides she will not have him, regardless of his improvement, that is not my failure either? Lady Hargrove was quiet for a moment. No, she said. That is biology. Vivian picked up the document. She was not brave. She was not particularly hopeful. She was a woman with £3.07 and a mother who needed medicine and a sister who deserved better than a merchant's son with moderate income and no connections. She accepted because she had no choice, and she accepted with her eyes open and her terms clearly stated, and when she set the document back on the desk with her name signed in her clean, clear hand, she felt not triumph but the particular steadiness of a decision made without illusion. That steadiness, she would later reflect, was the most dangerous thing about her. Carverstone House occupied the northeast corner of Grosvenor Square the way old money occupied space. Not aggressively, not apologetically, simply fully. It was Georgian architecture at its most unarguable. For stories of Portland stone, tall windows that admitted light in a way that suggested light was permitted here rather than welcomed. A door so black and so perfectly maintained it seemed to absorb the gray morning rather than reflect it. 2 stone lions flanked the entrance. Vivian had the uncharitable thought that they looked more relaxed than she felt. A footman admitted her. Another appeared to take her coat. A third materialized to indicate she should wait. She stood in the entrance hall and absorbed the intelligence it offered. The floors were Carrara marble, genuine, not painted, cost and permanence. The staircase curved upward with the easy confidence of craftsmanship that had not needed to justify itself for a century. The flowers in the arrangement near the door were fresh. Someone managed this house with care. The silence was complete. Not the silence of an empty house. The silence of a house that had learned not to make noise. She had been directed to a receiving room on the first floor. She followed the footman's directions for approximately 30 seconds before the door at the end of the corridor. The wrong door, the one that was slightly ajar and emanating the faintest smell of beeswax candles and leather binding, drew her. She had always been constitutionally incapable of passing an interesting door. She opened it. The library was everything the entrance hall had promised and more. 2 stories of books, a gallery running the upper level, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and 2 tall windows looking onto the square. At one of those windows stood a man with his back to her, facing the rain-gray street below. Broad shoulders, dark coat, silver-threaded hair, cut close. The angle of his head, slightly down, slightly to the left, the posture of a man thinking something difficult and declining to be interrupted. She noticed the scar before he turned. It caught the weak morning light along his jaw, a thin line running from just below his left ear toward his chin, the kind of scar that had been made quickly and healed slowly, the kind that did not let you forget Salamanca, not even in the quiet of your own library. He turned. She was aware that she should have curtsied immediately. She was also aware, in the fraction of a second before manners reasserted themselves, that she was measuring him the way she measured every room she entered. Assessing, cataloging, filing. She saw a face that was not handsome in the conventional sense but was completely and uncompromisingly itself. Gray eyes, direct as a question you did not expect. Lines at the corners from weather or thought or both. A jaw that suggested he had not smiled at anything inconsequential in quite some time. He was older than she had expected and younger looking than his reputation, and he had the stillness of a man who had stopped needing to fill silence with noise. He looked at her the way she had not been looked at in years. Not at the companion, not at the position, not at the cross name or the mended cuff or the resolute boots. He looked at the person. And then, precisely as she curtsied, his expression did something small and contained that she could not immediately classify. "You are not where you were directed," he said. His voice was low, measured, each word placed with the care of a man who knew that words, once released, did not come back. "I found a more interesting door," she said. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Grace." He studied her for a moment. The companion position has not yet been confirmed. Lady Hargrove paid the first installment this morning, Vivian replied. I believe that constitutes confirmation. The silence that followed was exactly 5 seconds long. She counted it. You had better come in then, Miss Cross. He moved toward the desk, which occupied the center of the room, and she understood this was where the conversation would happen. She crossed the library and did not look at the books, though she wanted to, because reading a man's library before you had earned the right to read him directly seemed presumptuous. She sat in the chair across from his without waiting to be asked. She saw his eyes register this. She saw him decide not to comment on it. Small evidence of a man who had learned to choose his battles, or who was already somehow paying attention. The desk was covered in the organized chaos of a man who actually worked. Estate ledgers stacked and tabbed. Parliamentary correspondence. She recognized the stamp of the Home Office on 2 envelopes. A map of Wiltshire with handwritten notations at the margins. And partially concealed under the largest ledger, face down, clearly placed there recently. A slim volume of poetry. The spine faced away. She filed it. He explained what he needed in the direct language of a man accustomed to not needing to explain anything. He was required to attend the season's functions. He was required to demonstrate that he was a man capable of sustaining ordinary human interaction. He was required, in short, to convince Miss Voss and her family that the arrangement would not constitute a form of polite imprisonment. What I will not do, Vivian said when he finished, is pretend to agree with you when you are wrong. I will not become furniture. I will not smile at people whose behavior does not merit smiling and then report back to you that everything went well. You are paying for accurate intelligence and genuine coaching, not performance. A pause. He had the expression of a man encountering something mildly unexpected in a landscape he thought he had fully surveyed. Most people do not give me a list of things they will not do. Most people, she said, have something to lose by being honest with you. I have already lost most of what was losable. It makes candor easier. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the rain intensified briefly and then eased. What precisely is your method? Lady Hargrove was not specific. People are not mysteries, Your Grace. They are patterns. They say what they say because they want something: reassurance, status, connection, relief. If I understand what they want, I can teach you to give them enough of it to make them comfortable without compromising anything fundamental about yourself. That is not deception. That is conversation. You make it sound simple. It is simple. It is just not easy. She met his eyes, those direct, unnerving gray eyes. We will not become friends. That is understood. This is a business arrangement. 8 weeks as agreed. I will do the work. You will do the work. At the end, you will have what you need from the season and I will have what I need from the arrangement, and we will both be better positioned than we are now. She paused. One more thing. If at any point your behavior toward me becomes anything other than what this arrangement specifically requires, I will leave. I will not be dismissed. I will leave. The discretion clause holds in either case. He did not answer immediately. She had the impression he was turning the speech over in his mind, examining it for cracks. Agreed, he said, and so it began. Here is what neither of them said, in that first hour across the library desk, that the arrangement made perfect sense as a transaction, that 2 people who had each, in their different ways, learned that trust was a resource best spent sparingly were entering into an agreement that would require, necessarily, something very close to trust, that the 8 weeks ahead would not take place in a vacuum, that the conversations that happened across a desk had a way of moving over time into the space between 2 people, and that space, once it opened, was not always easy to close. But people who know too much about endings rarely begin anything at all. And so they did not say it. They simply began. Almac's assembly rooms on King Street smelled of beeswax and ambition, and the particular anxiety of 200 people trying to appear entirely relaxed. The orchestra played a country dance with mechanical competence. The lemonade, which Vivian had been warned about and still found surprising in its absolute mediocrity, was tepid. The patronesses moved through the crowd with the deliberate calm of women who held the keys to the kingdom and knew it. A voucher to Almax was worth more than a letter of credit from a bank. To be refused one was social death delivered with a polite smile. Vivian stood at the edge of the third room, positioned where she could see the entrance and the Voss family's table simultaneously, and watched the Duke of Carverstone cause an incident. He was not trying to. That was perhaps the most alarming part. He stood near the fireplace in his evening clothes, dark coat, white cravat, the silver at his temples catching the candlelight, and he was simply present, in the way that a cold front is present, filling the air around him with the awareness that something significant was happening at a temperature slightly below comfortable. Two young debutantes had approached him, as young debutantes approached everything at Almax, with the calculations of women who had been told since girlhood that this room was the entire purpose of their existence, and he had answered their questions. Briefly, precisely, with the exact number of words required and not one syllable more. They had retreated. They were now whispering behind their fans with expressions suggesting they were not entirely certain whether they had been complimented or dissected. The baronet was worse. Sir Howard Bellamy, 40, red-faced, the sort of man who filled silences by talking and filled rooms by being loud, had approached the Duke with the determined bonhomie of someone who had decided to be the person who befriended the Duke of Carverstone and was already composing the story he would tell afterward. He had said something about the quality of the music. The Duke had said, in return, one sentence. Vivian did not hear it from where she stood. She heard only its effect, the silence that followed it, the baronet's face going through three distinct colors, and the lemonade that ended up on Sir Howard's own waistcoat as he stepped back with the flustered urgency of a man who suddenly needed to be somewhere else. Sir Howard Bellamy retreated. Across the room, Miss Eleanor Voss watched from her seat beside her mother. Her face said nothing, which Vivian was beginning to understand was how Miss Voss communicated the full range of her feelings. Vivian crossed the room. "You did that deliberately," she said, arriving at his elbow and keeping her voice low. "I answered his question. You did nothing. That is the problem. Your silence is not neutrality. It is a weapon you deploy without noticing you have drawn it." That man wanted 5 minutes of ordinary conversation. He wanted to feel that the Duke of Carverstone had briefly, without condescension, acknowledged that they occupied the same room. You gave him a verdict instead. He turned to look at her and she saw behind the controlled exterior something flicker. Not defensiveness. Curiosity. A verdict. You told him, without words, that he was not worth the effort of ordinary kindness. That is what he will report. And that is what Miss Voss heard from 30 feet away. She glanced across the room. Miss Voss had turned back to her mother, her expression still careful, still measuring. You need to ask questions. Specifically, you need to ask questions and then listen to the answers even if the answers bore you. "Very little interests me," he said. "Then you will need to manufacture interest for 8 weeks. If that is beyond you, I would prefer to discuss the second payment now, since the arrangement is already—" She stopped. He was looking at her differently. Not the measuring look of the library. Something less categorized. "What interests you, Miss Cross?" She had not expected to be asked. It threw her in a way that the whole of Almax, the scrutiny, the lemonade, the baronet incident had not. "Many things," she said, recovering. "Name one." She considered. "The way societies build the rules that constrain them and then pretend the rules are natural rather than chosen. The gap between what people say and what they mean. The architecture of conversation, why people say what they say, what they are actually asking, why the space between the question and the answer is almost always more informative than either." She paused, aware she had said more than she intended. "Why?" "Because that is exactly what I need to understand," he said. "And you described it as though it were obvious." He looked away, back toward the room, toward the Voss table, toward the evening that still required management. Show me. What is Sir Howard Bellamy actually asking? Underneath the comment about the music, Vivian looked at Sir Howard across the room, still repairing his waistcoat, still red-faced, but already beginning to compose himself. He is asking whether he is worthy of notice, whether a man like you, who has everything he does not, would condescend to confirm his existence. That is all. That is the entire question underneath every piece of small talk you will encounter this season. A pause. And the answer? The answer is always yes. You simply have to say it in a way that costs you nothing. She turned to face him fully. Ask him about his estate. He has one in Hampshire. I know because his wife mentioned it to Lady Pembury 3 months ago. Ask him one question about it. Listen to the first sentence of his answer. Say, that is admirably managed regardless of what he says, because what he says will be admirable by the standard of a man who is proud of it. It will take 4 minutes and it will cost you nothing, and he will dine out on it for a month. He studied her. You are describing a kindness delivered as strategy. I am describing a kindness that is still a kindness, regardless of its delivery mechanism. She held his gaze. That distinction matters to you. Good. Hold on to it. Now go speak to Sir Howard. He went. She watched from a distance as he crossed the room, as Sir Howard's expression shifted from wariness to cautious pleasure, as the conversation lasted 4 minutes and 40 seconds by her internal count, as Sir Howard laughed, genuinely, at something, and as the Duke produced, somewhere in the exchange, what she would not have described as a smile but was at least its architectural precursor. Vivian took a sip of the terrible lemonade. Tasted, she decided, of minor victories. The mornings became a pattern within the first week. 9 o'clock. The library. Coffee. His black. Hers, too strong by any reasonable measure. A habit she had acquired during the winter her father's trial had kept her awake for weeks and never surrendered. The fire already lit when she arrived. The estate documents moved to the side table to make room for what she had begun, privately, to think of as the work. He was, as a student, both infuriating and astonishing in turns. When she gave him scripts, stock phrases, conversational gambits, the particular art of the 2-sentence social question, he deployed them with the wooden precision of a man who had memorized them rather than understood them, and the results were painful. When she abandoned the scripts entirely and began instead to explain the human architecture underneath the conversation, the fear, the longing, the performance of adequacy that governed every drawing room in England, something in his attention shifted entirely. He leaned forward slightly. He asked follow-up questions that were sharper than she expected. He made connections she had not drawn for him. You already understand all of this? She said one morning, toward the end of the first week. You read people extremely well. You have always read people extremely well. That is precisely why your silences are so devastating. You know exactly what someone is hoping to hear, and you withhold it. He was quiet for a moment. Withholding is not cruelty. In this context, it is indistinguishable from it. He did not agree, but he did not dismiss it either, which she was beginning to understand was his version of concession. On the 8th morning, she dropped something. It was careless. She had been writing in the hour before he arrived, sitting at the small writing table near the east window with the particular focus that descended on her when the words were going well, and when she stood to make room for the session she knocked her folio and 3 loose sheets of paper escaped and drifted to the floor. She gathered 2. He was already across the room picking up the 3rd. He read 4 lines before she reached him. His face was completely still in the particular way it was still when he was paying serious attention. That is mine, she said, and took it from his hand. He let it go without resistance. He said nothing. But she had seen his eyes and he had read enough, not just what the lines said but what they indicated about the person who had written them. That there was a mind behind the companion's role that was doing something the companion's role had not been designed to contain. He did not ask. She did not explain. The sheet went back into her folio and they resumed the morning's work, and underneath the ordinariness of the hour something had shifted by exactly the width of 4 lines of prose. Their rhythms accumulated without ceremony. She discovered he read until 2 in the morning. She had come downstairs once for water and seen the light under the library door, heard the particular silence of a man absorbed in something. He discovered she catalogued prices automatically, reflexively, the way he calculated distances. She would look at a piece of furniture and know what it cost and what that cost meant about the person who had purchased it. He had never looked at a price in his life and she had never stopped looking, and this gap between them was both functional and something more complicated that neither of them named. Clara's letter arrived on a Thursday. Vivian read it at breakfast and read it again in the library before he arrived and sat with it for 10 minutes, feeling the particular cold of a plan beginning to develop cracks. The young man, Mr. Hartley, youngest son of a merchant family, had called twice. Clara described him as kind, sincere, and attentive. Clara did not describe him as well-connected or financially established or in possession of anything that would repair the cross name in the eyes of the society that had destroyed it. Clara described him as kind. Vivian wrote back, calm on the page, quietly terrified behind the pen. She did not forbid it. She had no authority to forbid, and Clara knew it. She simply reminded her sister that the £200 was nearly in hand, and that a real season was possible, and that kind was not, by itself, a sufficient foundation for a life in a world that required more than kindness from a woman's husband. She sent the letter and felt, distantly, like a hypocrite without being able to say why. The dinner at Carverstone House was a test. Vivian understood this, and she suspected Miss Voss understood it, and she was fairly certain, as the evening progressed, that even the Duke understood it, which was its own form of progress. 40 covers. The best china. Flowers that had cost someone a significant conversation with the florist. The Voss family arrived punctually. Mr. and Mrs. Voss, with the practiced ease of people who had attended many such dinners and knew how to perform ease, and Miss Eleanor Voss behind them, in pale blue silk that managed to be both fashionable and self-possessed simultaneously, with the dark hair and steady eyes of a woman who had been in training for exactly this sort of evening since she was old enough to sit at table. Vivian sat at the lower end of the dinner table, in the companion's position, present but not of consequence, there to observe and manage and disappear as required. It was a position she had occupied in various forms for 3 years. She was very good at it. She was also, if she was honest with herself in the quiet of her own mind, increasingly tired of it. She watched the Duke apply the lessons. He was not warm. Warmth was not, perhaps, his register. She was beginning to suspect that warmth, for him, was like a language learned in adulthood. You could achieve fluency, but you could not lose the accent. What he was, instead, was present in a way she had not seen him be at Almack's. He asked Miss Voss about the opera. She had mentioned it in a previous exchange. Vivian had mentioned the mention to him, and he had remembered. He listened to her answer, the full answer, not just the first sentence. He asked a follow-up question about the composer that was not polite but genuinely curious, and the surprise on Miss Voss's face was very small and very quickly managed and very informative. Miss Voss, Vivian noted, was extraordinary. She managed that dinner table the way a general managed terrain, knowing which guest needed drawing out, which needed containing, which would be better placed next to whom for the next course. She was 22 years old, and she had been doing this since she was 12, and she was very, very good at it. Watching her across the table, Vivian felt the unexpected sensation of professional respect. After dinner, while the men remained with their port, the women withdrew to the drawing room. It was during this interval, the peculiar female hour of regency entertaining, when women were expected to converse pleasantly about nothing of consequence until the men rejoined them, that Vivian found herself, through the mechanics of the room, briefly alone near the fire with Miss Voss. "You must find it rewarding work, Miss Cross?" Miss Voss said pleasantly. "Useful." The word was a blade, and they both knew it. "Enormously so, Miss Voss," Vivian replied, with equal pleasantness. "Though I confess the Duke is not quite the challenge Lady Hargrove suggested. He is, in fact, a rather quick study when properly motivated. Miss Voss's eyes shifted almost imperceptibly, but Vivian was very good at almost imperceptible. The word motivated had landed. Miss Voss was now uncertain whether Vivian was a professional or a variable. "I am pleased to hear it," Miss Voss said, and her tone had gone from blade to shield, which was its own kind of information. Lady Voss arrived then, and the conversation redirected, and Vivian returned to her proper position at the edge of the room. But as she stood there through the rest of the evening, through the men's return and the tea and the careful performance of a successful dinner coming to its conclusion, she was honest enough to notice that she had enjoyed Miss Voss's discomfort. She was also honest enough to notice that she was disturbed by having enjoyed it, because the only explanation for that enjoyment, the only real one, was something she had not yet permitted herself to examine. It was a Tuesday evening, 2 weeks into the arrangement. Parliament had kept him later than expected, and she had settled into the library with a book. She had discovered, 3 days in, that the Duke's library contained nothing formulaic and everything unexpected. Agricultural theory beside French philosophy, beside a battered collection of naval dispatches, beside 3 editions of the same Shakespeare play with different annotations in the same hand, growing from youthful certitude to mature doubt over what appeared to be a decade. She was reading the naval dispatches when he came in. He stopped briefly when he saw her, in the way of a man who had expected an empty room and found the emptiness occupied. Then he crossed to the decanter near the fireplace and poured 2 glasses without asking. One he set, without comment, on the table nearest her chair. The other he took to the window seat and sat with it. She looked at the glass. She looked at him. She picked up the glass. They sat in silence for perhaps 20 minutes. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It had the texture of 2 people who had spent enough time in a room together to stop needing to fill it. Outside, a carriage went past. The fire settled. The port was very good. She noted this as she noted everything, the specific quality of the thing, what it meant about the person who provided it. "The Peninsular War," she said eventually. Not "what was the fighting like?" Not "were you brave?" What was it like to leave? He turned from the window. The question had surprised him. She could see that, the slight recalibration. To leave England, you mean? Or to leave the war when it was over? To leave England. To go. He looked at the fire for a moment. "Clean," he said at last. "At the time, I had a duty that was clear and a purpose that required all of me and a distance from everything that had become complicated." He paused. "Catherine and I had been married 3 years when I left. She was not. She did not want me to go. I believed I was needed. I was right about that. I was also a man who found it easier to be needed at a distance than to be present up close." He said this without self-pity, with the flat delivery of a man who has examined a fact so many times that its power to hurt him has been replaced by something closer to recognition. She recognized the technique. She used it herself. "The letter from the estate manager," he said. "It came in late October. She had gone into labor 3 weeks early. By the time I received it, there was no possibility of returning in time. She was gone before I could." He stopped. The fire, the glass, the silence that held something he had not said to anyone. "You decided it was your fault before you had the facts," Vivian said quietly. He stiffened. She saw it. "It was my fault," he said. "That is your conclusion. I am asking about your evidence." She held his gaze when he looked at her, which he did, sharply, with something she could not quite read. "Early labor is not predictable. Complications in childbirth are not predictable. Your presence in Wiltshire instead of Spain would not have been surgical skill or medical knowledge. It might have been comfort. It would not have been a guarantee. You do not know." "No," she said. "I do not. Neither do you. And that uncertainty is the thing you have been carrying as though it were certainty." He did not answer. But he did not look away either, and he did not leave, which meant the words had landed somewhere they did not entirely want to land, and that was its own kind of honesty. She returned to her book. He sat with his port and the fire. When she finally rose to leave, She had reached the door when he spoke, not looking at her. "You are the most unusual woman I have ever employed, Miss Cross." She paused, her hand on the door. "I am the most unusual woman you have ever met, Your Grace. The employment is incidental." She left before he could respond. She did not sleep well. Not for any reason she was willing to examine. The second letter from Clara arrived on a Thursday morning, and it was, this time, not a letter about calling but a letter about a proposal. Mr. Hartley had asked. Clara, being Clara, bright and romantic and constitutionally incapable of doing anything by half, had said yes. She was writing to ask for Vivian's blessing before she told their mother. She wrote with the careful brightness of someone who suspected they were asking permission for something that might not be given and was choosing love anyway. Vivian read the letter 3 times. Then she set it on the library table and sat very still. A merchant's youngest son. No title, moderate income, no connections. Not disgraceful. Mr. Hartley was not, as far as Vivian had been able to determine, a bad man. By the standards of the world Vivian inhabited professionally, the world she had been sacrificing toward, the match was simply not strategic. It did not help. It did not repair. It did not advance the slow, 3-year project of holding the Cross name together with intelligence and stubbornness until something better became possible. Clara had chosen love over strategy, and Vivian's first reaction, she was ashamed of it but she was honest enough to name it, was fury. Not at Clara. At the situation. At the world that had made strategy necessary. At herself, perhaps, for having made Clara feel that strategy was what was wanted of her. The second reaction, arriving behind the first, was grief. The third reaction, slower than both, was the one she did not want. The recognition that Clara's choice frightened her because she understood it. She was in the library. She had gone there because she always went there, because the library had become, over 3 weeks, the place in the house where she felt most like herself, when the Duke found her. He read her face immediately. In the 3 weeks of working mornings together, she had not been this unguarded. She had not known she was capable of this unguardedness. Not anymore. "Your sister," he said. Not a question. "I did not. You receive her letters on Thursday mornings. You always look lighter when you read them and then carefully don't. This is Thursday. You look as though the careful part has broken." He crossed the room and stood at the edge of her line of sight, not pressing. "What happened?" She told him. Briefly, factually, the way she told him everything. She had learned early that he received information more easily when it was not wrapped in emotion. She told him about the proposal, about Mr. Hartley, about the season she had been working toward for Clara, about the modest and inadequate and perfectly sincere match that Clara had chosen instead of it. He listened without interrupting. She noticed this, filed it away alongside all the other things she had noticed about him in 3 weeks, the growing archive of evidence that he was not what his reputation said. "Do you want my opinion or my company?" he asked when she finished. She stopped. The question surprised her so thoroughly that she forgot to maintain the expression she had prepared. "Company," she said, before she had decided to say it. "For a moment, if that is not company." He sat in the chair across from hers. He did not speak. The fire was going. The rain, which had been the constant percussion of those April weeks, tapped the window. He stayed for 30 minutes. He did not offer wisdom or comfort or analysis. He simply occupied the room with her, and she discovered, in the way you discover things that have been true longer than you realized, that this was what she had needed precisely, and that almost no one in her life had known how to do it. Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens in May was everything Mayfair was not. Loud, slightly disreputable, beautifully lit by 1,000 lamps strung between the trees, smelling of sawdust and roasted meats, and the particular freedom of a place where the strict choreography of polite society relaxed by exactly enough degrees to be interesting. The Pleasure Gardens were the one venue in London where a duchess and a merchant's wife might stand within 10 feet of each other without either party being required to acknowledge the distance between them. Vivian liked Vauxhall. This surprised her every time she came. The evening had begun well. The Duke, 3 weeks further along in what Vivian privately called his rehabilitation, which was unfair to him but accurate about the work, was doing something she had not yet seen him do. He was relaxed. Not performing relaxation. Actually relaxed, in the way of a man who was outdoors after weeks of drawing rooms and assembly rooms and the relentless indoor performance of social adequacy. The lamplight suited him. The informality of the gardens gave him room to be something other than the Duke of Carverstone, and whatever that other thing was, it sat more easily on his shoulders. Lord Felix arrived at 9. Felix Ashford was 35 and charming in the way of a man who had discovered early that charm was an excellent substitute for reliability. He was not malicious. Vivian had assessed him carefully and found him genuinely fond of his brother, which was its own kind of character evidence. He was, however, 3 glasses of wine past strategic, and he arrived at their party with the happy momentum of a man who had not yet noticed that his momentum was the problem. Vivian intercepted him. She did it with the smooth precision of a woman who had managed difficult people in drawing rooms for 3 years. She placed herself between Felix and the Voss family's section of the party with the practiced naturalness of someone moving toward a conversation rather than away from a complication. She asked Felix about his horse. She had learned from the Duke, during a library morning, that Felix had recently purchased a bay gelding he was excessively proud of. Felix talked about the horse for 12 minutes. By the time he had finished, the wine's worst effects had leveled and the Voss family had moved to the supper boxes, and the crisis had been averted by the simple application of targeted conversation. She was aware during all of this of the Duke watching. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him now, a peripheral consciousness that she had stopped trying to argue away, that she simply managed the way you managed a door that wouldn't close quite completely, with the awareness that the draft was real even when you were not looking at it. During the fireworks, the group drifted. It happened the way things happened at Vauxhall. A surge of the crowd, a change of direction, a series of perfectly ordinary movements that separated the party by ones and twos and left Vivian standing on the dark walk with the Duke, away from the lamps and the crowd and the music, with the fireworks painting color above the tree line in soundless bursts of gold and white. Neither of them moved to rejoin the group. "What would you have done?" he asked, without preamble, looking up at the fireworks rather than at her. "If your father's disgrace had not happened, if the season had gone well, if the cross name had meant what it was supposed to mean." She thought about not answering. Then she thought about all the careful not answering she had done in 3 weeks, all the professional distance she had maintained with such discipline, and she was suddenly tired of it, at least for the length of a firework. "I would have written," she said. Not anonymous work. Real writing. The kind of commentary that takes the mechanisms of the world apart and shows people how they function. I have thoughts about the nature of education for women, about the economics of marriage, about the way this country's laws arrange women's lives as instruments of men's interests while calling it protection. I have a great deal to say, and no venue to say it in that would not destroy whatever remains of my position. You should write it anyway. She looked at him. He was still watching the fireworks. You are a Duke. You live inside a system that is working precisely as it was designed to work. You cannot recommend that I dismantle it from within hearing of the people it benefits. I am recommending that you write what you believe. And when the writing attaches my name to opinions that close every door I have managed to keep open, what then? Then you are free, he said simply, and then paused. I understand that freedom and destitution are not the same thing. I am not being glib. I am asking whether the writing you are not doing is costing you more than the doors. She was quiet for a long moment. The fireworks above them. The crowd's distant sound. Very close together in the dark. Close enough that she was aware of him in the specific way of warmth and proximity and the knowledge that neither of them had moved away. You are describing my silence as strategic, she said. And you have been describing mine the same way for weeks. The fireworks ended. The sky went dark and then relit and then dark again. The moment where something might have happened, where the space between them had narrowed to something that was not entirely professional, existed fully and completely, and they were both inside it. She stepped back first. Deliberately, without drama. He did not reach out to stop her. On the walk back to the group, neither of them spoke. But something had been irrevocably rearranged, the way furniture is rearranged in a room you know well. Nothing removed, nothing added, and yet the room is not the same. Lady Hargrove arrived the next morning at 10, which was not her scheduled day, and asked for Vivian in the front sitting room rather than the library, which told Vivian everything she needed to know before the conversation began. The room was bright with May morning light. Lady Hargrove sat with her hands folded in the precise way of a woman who had decided to remain calm about something. There was tea. There was a small folded document on the occasional table beside her. "You are doing your job admirably, Miss Cross," she said, before Vivian had entirely settled. "The Duke's improvement is beyond what I had hoped for. Miss Voss is warming to him. The match will be made before the season ends. I am gratified to hear it. I watched him at Vauxhall last night." A pause. "I watched how he managed Lord Felix's arrival. Or rather, how he watched you manage it. I watched where he positioned himself through the evening." Another pause, careful and precise. "I watched him find you in the crowd during the fireworks rather than returning to the Voss party." Vivian said nothing. "You have done nothing wrong," Lady Hargrove said. "I want to be clear about that. You have behaved with complete propriety. This is not a conversation about conduct." She pushed the folded document across the table. "The Countess of Stafford is looking for a companion for her European tour. 2 years. Switzerland, Italy, Greece. The salary is generous. I have negotiated it myself. The letter of introduction there is mine. I am offering it now rather than at the arrangement's conclusion because I believe you will want time to consider it." Vivian looked at the letter. It was more than generous. It was extraordinary. Europe for 2 years. An income that would settle her mother's situation permanently. A position that was, by any practical measure, the best thing that had been offered her in 3 years. "You are paying me to leave more thoroughly than the original arrangement required," Vivian said. "I am paying you," Lady Hargrove said, "because you are worth it, and because I believe you are intelligent enough to understand that what you are feeling, and what he is beginning to feel, cannot end well for either of you if it is allowed to develop. You know this world. You know what it does to women who reach for what is not designated for them." Vivian picked up the letter. She turned it over in her hands. Lady Hargrove stood. "The betrothal announcement is in 3 weeks. The second payment will be delivered the morning after. Take the Stafford position, Miss Cross. Take it and go somewhere large enough for your intelligence to have room to breathe. You deserve that at minimum." She left. Vivian sat with the letter for a long time. Outside, London went about its business. The practical choice was clear. The right choice was obvious. The arrangement had terms and she had agreed to them, and she was not the kind of woman who reneged on agreements. She knew this. She said this to herself precisely, in the language she used when she was being most honest. Then she said also precisely, she was not certain she wanted to make the obvious choice. And this was more frightening than anything else that had happened in 5 weeks, because she had always known what she wanted to choose. That certainty had been her most reliable thing. 3 days before the formal betrothal dinner, a copy of the pamphlet arrived at Carverstone House. It was the April edition. Vivian had written the piece in early March, before the arrangement existed, before she had any reason to think she would be inside one of the households she was writing about. She had written it from the outside, with the clarity of a woman who had observed the marriage market professionally for years and had very precise feelings about what she observed. The piece was titled, "On the Market, Its Merchandise, and the Currency of Approval." It was, by the standards of the radical pamphlet she wrote for, moderate in tone. By the standards of Grosvenor Square, it was incendiary. It described the London season as an economic transaction in which women were brought to market as instruments of political alliance, assessed by family connections and compliant temperament and the width of their father's estate, and awarded to the highest bidder under the name of matrimony. It described this not as a failure of individual men, but as a design feature of a system that depended on women's compliance for its maintenance. It was brilliant and it was furious, and, in 3 passages that had been underlined by someone, it was very specific in its observations. A footman delivered it to her with a note from the Duke. "My library. Now, if convenient." He was at the desk when she arrived. The pamphlet was open before him, the 3 underlined passages facing up. He looked at her when she entered with the expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion and was verifying it. "You knew," he said, "not accusation, verification. I suspected you might eventually encounter one." "How long?" 3 years. "Since the autumn after my father died." She sat down. She had not waited to be asked, and he had not asked, and this familiarity was itself evidence of something neither of them was discussing. "The pamphlet has a small circulation. The pieces are unsigned. I never expected." "This passage," he said, touching the page without looking up. The passage in question described a woman in a drawing room who understood precisely what she was worth in settlements and bloodlines and political alliances, and who attended the season knowing this as surely as she knew the price of bread, because for women of a certain position the two were not separate calculations. Was this written about Miss Voss? It was not written about any specific woman. Was it written about Miss Cross? She held his gaze. She did not answer. The answer was already in the room. He closed the pamphlet. He stood and moved to the window, his position when he was thinking something difficult, and stood with his back to her for long enough that she thought he might simply send her away. She prepared for it. She assembled the professional calm she wore when situations required it. "Why?" he said, to the window. "Did you take this position? If you believe the institution you were hired to serve is a market in human dignity?" "Because my mother needs medicine," she said. "Because my sister deserves a future. Because moral purity is a luxury reserved for people who can afford to be hungry, and I have been hungry enough that the principle tastes different than it does in theory." She paused. "I did not believe the arrangement would compromise me. I am not certain it has. I have done the work I was hired to do, and I have done it well, and I stand by the writing, and if that creates an impossibility for you, then I will accept the terms of termination as agreed." He turned around. He looked at her with something she could not categorize. Not anger, not disappointment, not the cool judicial distance he wore in rooms that required management. Something more open than any of those. Something that had the quality of a man seeing something clearly for the first time and finding, against all expectation, that what he sees is not a problem. "I have known it," he said quietly, "since the second morning, that the mind doing this work was not content to do only this work. That there was someone behind the role who was considerably more than the role required." He moved away from the window. "I did not say anything because I did not think it was my place to. It is your intelligence, your privacy, your work." He stopped 2 paces from the desk. "I am not going to report you. I am not going to use it as leverage. I am telling you that I know because you deserve to know that I know." Vivian was not, as a rule, caught without words. "James," she said, and then stopped, because she had used his name without deciding to, and the word in the air between them was its own kind of boundary crossed. He did not comment on it. He simply looked at her, that direct, gray-eyed, carefully honest look that she had been storing in the archive she pretended not to keep. That evening the house was quiet. The planned dinner had been cancelled. She did not know why, only that the house had a different quality of silence, less managed, less performed. She went to the portrait gallery because she had been meaning to see it since the first week, and because the house's unusual quietness made the ordinary rules feel briefly flexible. She had been there perhaps 10 minutes when she heard him behind her. She had been looking at the 7th Duke, a man in Elizabethan dress with the same gray eyes the current Duke carried, the same quality of unsmiling directness, when his footsteps sounded on the gallery floor. "Come in, Miss Cross," he said, as though the gallery were a room she might be uncertain of entering rather than one she was already standing in. She turned. He was at the far end of the gallery, standing before a portrait she had not yet reached. Even from a distance, she recognized what she was seeing. A woman painted in the informal style, in a pale morning dress, caught in a moment of laughter, head tilted, dark hair loose at her shoulders, eyes bright with something the painter had caught without quite understanding. The happiness in the portrait was private. It had not been painted for public consumption. She walked the length of the gallery and stood beside him. "She would have liked you," he said, before Vivian had spoken. "Catherine, she had no patience for pretension. She used to say that pretension was just fear dressed in better clothes, and she had a theory that the more frightened a person was, the more elaborately they dressed their fear." He was quiet for a moment. She would have had a very precise opinion of the baronet's waistcoat. Vivian almost smiled. "She sounds remarkable." She was. He looked at the portrait. Not the way he had looked at it 6 years, she thought, with the careful removal of a man managing grief, but with the direct, honest gaze of someone making peace with something. "She is the reason I understand what you are doing when you explain people to me." She did the same thing. Not strategically, she simply loved them too clearly not to see them. "I found it alarming when we first met. I found her, extraordinary." He stopped. He looked at Vivian. "I do not want to marry Miss Voss," he said. The gallery was very still. "Your Grace." "James." "I cannot." She stopped. She tried again. "What you want and what you must do are separate conversations. You understand this better than I do. You have understood it for years." "Yes. Your brother cannot inherit. Parliament will not permit it. The estate, the title, everything you have built and everything, Catherine." She stopped again. "You have obligations that are not personal." "Yes," he said again with the same flat certainty. "Then what are you telling me?" He crossed the gallery. Slowly, giving her every possible chance to step back, to redirect, to invoke the professional distance she carried like a second coat. She did not step back. He stopped close enough that she could see, in the gallery's low light, the precise gray of his eyes. "I am telling you that for the first time in 6 years I am not managing. I am not performing. I am not maintaining a distance that I chose because the alternative was too complicated." He looked at her steadily. "I am awake. And I need you to know that before you leave, because you are going to leave. I know you are going to leave. The arrangement is clear. The Stafford letter is on your table and you should take it because it is the right thing for you. And I need you to know before you go that you are the reason." "The reason I am awake," he said quietly. After 6 years of managing a very elegant sleep, she stood in the space between two entirely different versions of her life. The one on the left, practical, correct, well-managed, a clean departure in the morning with her full payment and the Stafford letter and her family's future secured. The one on the right, unknown, complicated, carrying a cost she could see clearly because she had spent 3 years cataloging exactly this kind of cost in women around her. "This cannot be," she said, came out quiet, not cruel, certain in the way that things are certain when they cost you something to say. "I know what would happen to Clara. If your connection to me were known, if it became known that the Duke of Carverstone had feelings for his hired companion, while in the process of a formal betrothal to Miss Voss, what would happen?" He was silent. He was an honest man. That was, she had decided, both his best and most devastating quality. "It would be difficult," he said. "It would be finished. Everything I have held together for 3 years with both hands. Every penny I have sacrificed toward. Every letter I have written to Clara about patience and strategy and the future I was building toward her. Finished. You are asking me to let go of it for nothing that can properly be offered. I know." His voice was even, which was the sound of a man accepting the full weight of a truth rather than arguing with it. "I am not asking you for anything, Vivian. I am telling you what is true, so that you carry it with you." Because you told me the truth when I didn't know I needed it, and it seems to me that the least I can do is return the courtesy. She left the gallery. He did not follow. This was the difference between him and every other man she had encountered in 3 years of watching men behave in rooms. He understood that no meant no, even when no cost him something, even when the no had not quite been a no but had been a not now not like this, which was its own kind of bravery. She sat in her room in the dark for a very long time. She thought about the architecture of women's lives, which she had written about from a safe distance and was now standing inside. She thought about Clara and her mother and £3.07 and the physician's bill. She thought about the library mornings and the silent port and the Vauxhall fireworks and a man who, when she had needed company without explanation, had simply sat down and stayed. She did not sleep, but she did, sometime near 3 in the morning, make a decision. She was not yet ready to know what the decision was, so she folded it carefully and put it somewhere she would find it in a few days, when she was ready. The formal dinner was 40 guests, the best silver, candles in every room, and the specific tension of an evening that everyone understood to be a performance with consequences. Vivian should not have been there. Lady Hargrove had asked her to stay one more night for the social management. She had agreed before the portrait gallery and regretted it after, but she was not a woman who went back on her word. She moved through the evening with the professional competence of someone doing a job they have learned to do well regardless of internal weather. She managed the seating. She managed Lord Felix, who arrived sober, which was an event and seemed to be trying. She managed the conversation at the lower tables. She managed herself. Before dinner, during the interval when guests were arriving and the drawing rooms were full of managed introductions, Miss Voss found her. "A moment, Miss Cross?" They stood near the window in the small anteroom. Miss Voss was in ivory silk. She was perfectly composed, as always. Her composure, Vivian had come to understand, was not performance, it was genuine. She had simply never been permitted to be anything else. "He doesn't want to marry me," Miss Voss said. "Miss Voss, I am not asking you to confirm it. I have watched him. I have watched him for 6 weeks and he has been improved genuinely, and I am sure that is your doing and I respect it. But there is a difference between a man who is learning to be present in a room and a man who is present for a reason." She paused, and for a fraction of a second the perfect composure did something very small. A shift at the eyes, a brief loosening at the jaw. "I don't particularly want to marry him either. I want the title and the security and the end of my mother's campaigns. That is honest and I am not ashamed of it. You of all people will understand that honesty." She straightened. "But I will not spend 40 years married to a man who reads someone else the way he reads you." Vivian had no answer. She stood very still. "He has never done anything improper," Miss Voss continued. "I know that. You have both been, whatever this is, it has been conducted with considerable propriety. That is precisely why it is impossible to pretend it is nothing. Improper things can be dismissed. This cannot." She met Vivian's eyes directly, woman to woman, past all the architecture of rank and position. "I am not going to withdraw. My family cannot bear it. But I wanted you to know that I am not oblivious. And that whatever you decide, decide it honestly." She returned to the drawing room. Vivian stood in the anteroom for 2 full minutes. The Duke appeared. He had been looking for her. She saw it in his face when he found her, the brief release of something he had been holding. He saw her expression. "Miss Voss," Vivian said. "What did she?" "She is remarkable," Vivian said. "She is the most self-aware person in this building and possibly in this postcode." She looked at him. "She deserves someone who is there for her specifically." "Yes," he said, quiet. A full agreement, no reservation. "Vivian," her name, in his voice, in that quiet anteroom. "Please," she said, "please do not. Let me leave cleanly. Let this evening end with everything in its right place and let me go tomorrow and let us both do the right thing. I am asking you not as a professional, not as part of any arrangement. I am asking you as one person to another. Let me go. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. He let her go. The dinner proceeded. The betrothal announcement, as planned, was made. The room responded with the appropriate warmth. Vivian stood at her position near the wall and watched the Duke accept congratulations with a face that was perfectly controlled and eyes that, once in the space between one guest's departure and another's arrival, found hers across the room and stayed for exactly 1 second. 1 second. She went to bed. She did not sleep. She found, sometime in the 4 o'clock darkness, the decision she had folded away 3 nights earlier. She looked at it. She found that she knew what it was. It was not clever. It was not strategic. It was the least calculated thing she had done in 3 years. It frightened her in the specific way that only real things frightened her, not with the cold fear of scarcity but with the warmer, more dangerous fear of something she actually wanted being real enough to lose. The morning was gray and fine and smelled, as London always smelled at 7 in the morning, of coal smoke and horse and the damp stone of streets that had been wet for 6 weeks and had long since stopped bothering to dry between rains. The second payment had been delivered with her breakfast. 2 folded banknotes in a sealed envelope with Lady Hargrove's crest. Vivian counted them. She put them in the inner pocket of her pelisse, the good but mended one, against her heart, where she kept important things. The Stafford letter was in her bag. She descended the stairs at Carverstone House for the last time. She did not look at the library door. She did not look toward the portrait gallery. She kept her eyes forward and her posture correct, and she walked out into the morning. The hired carriage was waiting. She got in. It moved. She was 3 streets from Grosvenor Square when the carriage stopped at the corner to let a milk cart pass, and in that pause a footman appeared, not from Carverstone House, she noted, from the solicitor's office, with a letter marked urgent. From Bath. Clara's handwriting. She broke the seal. She read it. She read it again. Then she sat with it in her lap and looked out the window at the grey London morning with the expression of a woman who has been told something she did not expect to be told. Clara had ended the engagement. Not because of pressure. Not at anyone's instruction. Clara had ended it because she had, in her 19-year-old way, done something that Vivian had spent 3 years trying and largely failing to do. She had looked at what she was choosing and asked whether she was choosing it for herself or for someone else's idea of what she should want. She had found that the answer was not quite clear enough, and she had, with great kindness to Mr. Hartley, declined. The letter ended, I realized, Viv, that I have been doing what I thought you wanted. And then I thought, when did you last do what you wanted? When did anyone ask? I think you should ask yourself. I think you should actually answer. Vivian read this 3 times. She sat with it in the moving carriage for the length of 4 streets. She thought about the architecture of women's lives, the ones she had written about so precisely for 3 years, the ones she had described to a duke across a library desk with such clear-eyed analysis, the ones she had navigated with intelligence and stubbornness and the refusal to disappear. She thought about all the choices she had made for other people's futures and all the choices she had not made because they were inconvenient or impractical or carried a cost she could calculate and therefore feared. She had £200. She had a letter of introduction to the finest European tour available to a companion of her position. She had done what she was hired to do, and she had done it well, and she had every right to go. She also had, Clara had named it without knowing she was naming it, a great deal of wanting that she had been filing away for later, under the heading of things that were real enough to lose. She did not turn the carriage around. That would have been too easy. She went to her lodgings and sat down at her desk. She wrote for 4 hours. Not the pamphlet style. Not the careful anonymity of a woman making an argument from behind a screen. She wrote with her name on it, from the first line, Vivian Cross, daughter of Edward Cross, solicitor, late of Gray's Inn, companion, woman, someone who had spent 3 years being usefully present at the edges of other people's lives and had recently, with some difficulty, decided to move toward the center of her own. The argument she made was about the cost of strategic invisibility, What is surrendered when a woman agrees to be useful rather than seen, to be competent rather than known, to perform the social labor of entire households while belonging to none of them? She wrote about education and its limits, about the law's architecture and the women it was designed to maintain, about the difference between the world as it was built and the world as it might be built differently. She did not name the Duke. She did not name any house or any season or any drawing room specifically. She did not need to. The specificity was in every sentence, the kind that comes from having lived inside the argument rather than observed it from a safe distance. She did not include the Stafford letter with her post. She sent the piece to the publisher with her name, and then she sat back and felt the particular lightness of a person who has stopped carrying something they had not realized was heavy. Whatever happened next, she had stopped being a woman who lived only at the edges of her own life. This was not nothing. In fact, she thought, looking at the empty desk, it might be everything. 3 days later, an unexpected caller. Not the Duke. Lord Felix Ashford arrived at her lodgings on a Tuesday afternoon in the manner of a man who had been given a very specific assignment and was extremely pleased with himself for not losing the written instructions. He produced, from his coat pocket, a folded note. He held it with the care of someone transporting a diplomatic communication of significant international consequence. "He made me swear," Felix said, "not to improvise. I am going to try not to improvise. Historically, this has been difficult for me." "Lord Felix," Vivian said, from the doorway of her sitting room. "What has happened?" "Right," Felix said and unfolded the note. "James has, the betrothal has been formally withdrawn. By mutual agreement, before you ask, not by dramatic unilateral gesture, which I told him would have been more satisfying from a narrative standpoint, but he did not seem to be optimizing for narrative satisfaction. He glanced up. "Miss Voss is, according to my brother, managing the situation with considerable grace and no small relief. The Voss family is handling it as a mutual withdrawal. Society will speculate briefly and then move on to something more interesting, which is the great mercy of the season. It is always producing something more interesting." He looked back at the note. "Lady Hargrove is not speaking to James. This is not unprecedented. Their record suggests she stops not speaking to him within a fortnight." "Lord Felix, I am getting to it," he said, not without dignity. He found the relevant section. "He is not asking you to come back. That is, he wanted me to say that first specifically because he suspected you might close the door at the word asking. He is asking instead whether you would be willing to receive him, formally, properly, in the full view of anyone who cares to observe." He looked up. "He wanted me to tell you, and I am quoting literally here because he made me repeat it back twice, that he is aware of every implication. That he has examined them with the same thoroughness he applies to parliamentary business. That he is not asking you to sacrifice anything. That he is asking whether you would be willing to let him try to build something that does not require you to be." Felix squinted at the paper. "Invisible" was the word he used, which, knowing you, I imagine he chose carefully. Vivian stood very still in the doorway of her sitting room. She was aware of her heart doing something her composure had not been consulted about. "Does he know," she said, "that I published the piece? Under my own name?" Felix checked the note. Anticipating this question, he added, "I read it this morning. It is the best thing she has written. The Morning Post will have it by Friday, and there will be consequences, and I intend to write a letter to the editor in support before those consequences arrive." He looked up. "He also says, this part appears to be addendum. Tell her that a duke writing a letter to the editor in support of a woman's political commentary will cause a parliamentary incident, and I find I am not as concerned about parliamentary incidents as I once was." A pause. Felix folded the note with the careful precision of a man who had just delivered something significant and knew it. "Right answer or wrong answer?" he said, with the expression of a younger brother who has, for once in his life, arrived at exactly the right moment. "Tell him," Vivian said, "that I will see him tomorrow." In the park. The fashionable hour. In full view of anyone who cares to watch. Felix grinned. He had, she noted, a very good grin. The kind that was genuine rather than performed, that was pleased on someone else's behalf rather than his own. He is going to be impossibly calm about this, Felix said. And I am going to find it insufferable. I want you to know I support you completely anyway. He left. She sat back down at her desk and found that the blank sheet of paper in front of her was, for the first time in a very long time, not something she needed to fill. She had enough words for today. Hyde Park, the fashionable hour. 6 o'clock of a May evening, the light long and golden, the air smelling of cut grass and the Thames in the distance and the particular smell of a London that was, briefly, beautiful. Every carriage in London appeared to be taking the air. Vivian arrived on foot, because she did not have a carriage and she had decided she was finished pretending about things she did not have. She wore her good pelisse, the one that was mended at the left cuff and entirely resolute at the shoulder, and her practical boots and her dark hair pinned without ceremony, and she arrived with her head up and the particular quality of a woman who has put down a weight she has been carrying for 3 years and discovered that she is taller without it. He was waiting, not positioned to advantage. Not placed where he would be seen entering. Simply standing at the appointed spot, watching her come toward him, with the expression of a man who has decided something and is at peace with the decision in the specific way that comes from having examined it thoroughly rather than arrived at it in haste. He was in his dark coat, no hat, the silver at his temples catching the late light. The scar at his jaw was visible. It was always visible. He had never seemed inclined to conceal it, which she had decided early was a form of honesty that most men of his position did not manage. He was not smiling. He was present. There was a difference. People noticed them. Of course they did. This was the fashionable hour in Hyde Park, which was the single most socially observed location in England. The carriage slowed. 2 ladies on horseback turned their heads. Somewhere behind Vivian, a conversation paused at a volume that suggested it had been redirected toward them. Neither of them looked away from the other to check. "Good evening, Miss Cross," he said when she reached him. "Good evening, Your Grace." And then, because they had earned this, James, he offered his arm. She took it. They began to walk. "The piece was published this morning," she said, when they were far enough from the entrance to have room for honest conversation. "I know. I read it at 6. It is going to cause considerable conversation." "Good." He said it with a calm that was not indifference but decision. "Considerable conversation is how things change. I have been in Parliament for 12 years and have said very little of consequence, on the theory that consequence was someone else's business. I find I am revising that position." She looked at him sidelong. "You are being reckless. I am being present." He met her gaze. "You told me in the first week that the difference between my silence being neutrality and it being a weapon was whether I was choosing it consciously. I have been thinking about that for 5 weeks. It applies to more than Almax. Your aunt is going to write you a letter," Vivian said. "Several. She writes excellent letters when she is displeased. I have considered framing them." She laughed. Not the controlled social version, the real one that she kept for people who had earned it. It came out into the May air of Hyde Park, and several people in the nearest carriage heard it, and the Duke of Carverstone looked at her when she laughed with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing without knowing he was waiting for it and has just been given it. They walked the full circuit of the park. The conversation that happened on that walk, about the piece, about the parliamentary letter he was already drafting, about Clara and Mr. Hartley and what love looked like when it was chosen with open eyes, about the portraits in the gallery and the books she had not yet been permitted to borrow and the coffee that was too strong and the port that was very good, was not a dramatic conversation. It was not an arrival. It was a beginning, in the full, honest sense of a word that contains within it everything that comes after. The complications and the arguments and the aunt's letters and the society that would have opinions and the work of building something between 2 people who had each, in their different ways, learned that trust was the thing most worth spending carefully. The path was not simple. There would be Lady Hargrove to manage, and she was manageable because she was a woman of intelligence who respected intelligence. And eventually she would see what Vivian already knew, that a duke who had been sleepwalking for 6 years was more useful to his line and his parliament and his 40,000 Wiltshire acres awake. There would be the Morning Post and the pamphlets and the parliamentary incident and the drawing rooms full of women who would have to decide whether they were more interested in gossip or in the fact that someone had finally said the true thing out loud with a name attached. There would be Felix, who would find all of it magnificently entertaining and be occasionally useful in ways he would be entirely too pleased about. There would be Clara, coming to London for a proper season with a sister who now had something she had not had before, the knowledge that she was not required to be useful in order to deserve what was good. This was, Vivian thought, the most valuable thing she had to give her. There would be the writing, her name on it now, always permanently, and the conversations it started, and the doors it closed and the ones it opened, and the gradual, difficult, non-linear work of saying things that needed saying in a world that preferred that they remain unsaid. And there would be this. A man who understood the cost of everything and was choosing her with full information and open eyes, not despite who she was but because of it. A man who had been given every opportunity to be less than he was and had chosen, again and again, to be honest. A man who, when she had needed company without explanation, had simply sat down and stayed. The circuit of the park ended at the Grosvenor Gate. They stopped. Around them, the fashionable hour continued its fashionable business. Carriages, horses, the practiced observation of a society that ran on the currency of information about what people were doing and with whom. "You will come to dinner," he said. Not a question. Not quite an invitation. The tone of a man who has decided to be present and is practicing it in the simplest form available. "Yes," she said. "And after dinner," he said, "there is a shelf in the library, the second gallery, left side, the one you have been looking at every morning for 5 weeks without touching. You may borrow anything you like." She looked up at him. "The poetry," she said. "Under the ledger." "John Donne," he said. It seemed too early to mention. She started to laugh again. She was doing that a great deal today, she noted, and could not bring herself to regulate it. He was almost smiling. Not quite, but close enough to almost that it changed his entire face. She took his arm again. They walked through the Grosvenor Gate into the evening, in full view of everyone, not hiding, not explaining, two people who had each been very lonely for a very long time and had found, in a library on a wet April morning, across a desk covered in ledgers, that the thing they had stopped expecting was, in fact, possible. This is how the true ones begin. Not with declarations. Not with grand gestures. With a conversation that becomes honest before either party intended it to. With someone who, when asked whether they wanted opinion or company, chose company. With the slow, patient, irrevocable work of letting someone see you. Vivian Cross did not wait to be rescued. She built the rescue herself, one difficult decision at a time. And in doing so, she teaches us something important. Competence and worth are not the same thing. A woman can be extraordinarily good at surviving and still deserve more than survival. Knowing the difference is not weakness. It is wisdom. The Duke of Carverstone spent 6 years punishing himself for a grief that was real but a guilt that was not. He teaches us that the stories we tell ourselves about our own failures, the ones we repeat until they feel like facts, deserve the same honest cross-examination we would give any other evidence. You are not always the villain of your own story. Sometimes you are simply a person who has been carrying a verdict without a proper trial. Miss Voss, who might have been a villain in a lesser story, is instead a reminder that women who play the game as it was built for them are not contemptible. They are rational. The system that built the game deserves the examination, not the women it shaped. True change begins not with judging those who adapted to unjust structures, but with naming the structures themselves. And this, finally, writing your name on something true, even when it costs you, even when the doors close, even when the world you live in does not yet have room for what you are saying, is not recklessness. It is how the room gets bigger. It is always how the room gets bigger. If this story reached you today, if Vivian's voice felt real, if the Duke's silence said something to you, if you found yourself pausing at any line and sitting with it for a moment, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. Stories like this are not made in a vacuum. They are made for people who are paying attention, and you are clearly one of them. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Your support through subscriptions, likes, and comments keeps these voices alive. This channel is your space too. Now let's keep building it together. Regency England is gone. The season, the vouchers, the marriage market, the way a woman's entire financial and social existence could be erased by a single piece of gossip. These are history. And yet, the questions at the heart of this story are not historical. How many of us are still performing our competence in rooms we do not belong to, hoping no one notices the mended cuff? How many of us have filed away what we really want under later so many times that later has become a word we no longer look at directly? How many of us have carried a verdict against ourselves, as the Duke carried his, without ever calling for the evidence? These are not questions that went away in 1814. Vivian Cross published her name. The Duke of Carverstone went for a walk in a public park. Two people chose each other with full knowledge of the cost and full acceptance of the complications ahead. None of it was simple. All of it was worth it. That is the story. That is, perhaps, always the story. Before we close, one question, and I genuinely want to know your answer. At the end, when Vivian is sitting at her desk with the blank page in front of her and Clara's letter in her hand, before Felix ever arrives, before she knows how any of it turns out, what would you have done? Would you have taken the Stafford letter and gone to Europe? Or would you have stayed? Drop your answer in the comments. There is no wrong answer. But I have a feeling your answer will tell you something true about yourself. And if this story moved you, if you heard yourself in any of it, please subscribe so you are here when the next one arrives. These stories are built for people who listen all the way to the end. You are clearly one of them. Until the next one, and there will be a next one.